The autumn of 1879 descended upon the Bitterroot Mountains of the Montana Territory with a chilling, atmospheric weight that the few settlers in the region had learned to respect. In this remote, jagged landscape, where the wind howls through the ponderosa pines and the shadows of the peaks stretch long across the valley floors, a farmer named Elijah Renner lived a life defined by isolation and grueling labor. However, for a period of nearly 6 months that year, Renner's life was defined by something far more profound and terrifying than the elements. Hidden within the weathered timber walls of his barn, Renner kept a secret that challenged the very foundations of human history. This secret stood 12 feet 4 inches tall. It possessed skin the texture and color of ancient, weathered parchment, tough, wrinkled, and seemingly resistant to the bite of the mountain air. Its fingers were elongated, longer than a grown man's forearm, ending in nails that looked more like polished stone than keratin. But it was the eyes that haunted Renner the most. In his private journals, he described them as being older than the rocks themselves, possessing a silver-gray depth that seemed to hold the memory of epochs long forgotten by modern man. To sustain this gargantuan guest, Renner engaged in a daily ritual of clandestine care. He fed the being thick loaves of homemade bread, heavy portions of beef, and buckets of fresh well water. He maintained this facade of normalcy with agonizing precision, hiding the truth from his wife, Martha, from his curious neighbors, and even from the traveling preacher who passed through the valley that summer offering salvation to the scattered homesteaders. Renner knew that what he was harboring was not merely a biological anomaly, but a living relic of a world that was being systematically erased. When the United States Army finally descended upon his farm on October 9, 1879, Renner had only enough time to transcribe the final haunting revelations the giant had shared in the days prior. That original journal was immediately confiscated by the authorities. The giant, bound in heavy chains and draped in buffalo hides, was hauled away in a reinforced covered wagon escorted by a contingent of 22 armed soldiers. Elijah Renner himself was not spared. 3 weeks later, he was committed to an insane asylum in Helena, where he languished until his death in 1883. The official record of Elijah Renner ended there, buried in the archives of a territorial madhouse. However, history has a way of resurfacing. In 1971, a direct descendant of the Renner family was renovating the original farmhouse when they discovered a second, secret journal hidden deep within a wall cavity. The contents of that journal, preserved for nearly a century, have remained a closely guarded secret until today. Before we delve into the staggering details of Renner's second journal, we invite you to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Every week, we investigate the buried history of the Old World, the enigmatic Tartarian records, the survivors of the global mudfloods, and the accounts of the forgotten giants who once walked this earth. If you are someone who seeks the truth beneath the polished surface of mainstream history, you belong here. To truly grasp the significance of what transpired on Elijah Renner's farm, we must look beyond the immediate events of 1879. We must look back to a world that the standard history books have quietly and deliberately scrubbed from the collective memory. In the mid-1800s, the American frontier was not the pristine, empty wilderness depicted in modern textbooks. The pioneers and settlers who pushed westward into the territories of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and the Dakotas frequently encountered architectural and archaeological anomalies that defied explanation. They found massive stone foundations of buildings that no known civilization had constructed. They discovered roads paved with unknown materials, harder than the finest granite, leading into high mountain passes where no modern city had ever stood. Miners reported finding wells dug with such mathematical precision that they appeared to be the work of advanced engineers rather than primitive frontiersmen. Most compelling of all were the bones, enormous humanoid skeletons that turned up with startling frequency. The newspapers of the 19th century were replete with these accounts. Publications like the Helena Independent, the Bozeman Avant Courier, and the Deer Lodge New Northwest regularly featured front-page reports of skeletons measuring 9, 10, or even 14 feet in length. These were not sensationalist ghost stories meant to sell papers. They were documented news items, often accompanied by sworn affidavits from reputable doctors, county surveyors, and high-ranking military officers. In this context, Elijah Renner's claim of keeping a living giant in his barn was not as outlandish as it might seem to a modern audience. What set Renner's account apart was the fact that his giant was alive, and it was capable of speech. Elijah Renner was not a man prone to flights of fancy. At 46 years old, he was a pragmatic Pennsylvania Dutch immigrant who had moved west in 1864 to escape the grief of losing his first wife to scarlet fever. By 1867, he had remarried Martha Voss, a widow with 2 young sons, and together they carved out a modest existence on 60 acres of land along the Bitterroot River. Their farm was a quiet place, supported by a small herd of cattle, a flock of sheep, and a vegetable garden tended by Martha and a Salish woman named Mary Two Rivers. The isolation of the farm was absolute. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the town of Stevensville was a full day's ride. This isolation provided the perfect shroud for the events that began on the night of April 17, 1879. According to the Hidden Journal, a fierce spring storm had been battering the mountains for 2 days. Renner had ventured out into the high pasture just before dawn to check on his sheep when he stumbled upon a massive shape lying in the mud. Initially, he mistook it for a fallen timber or a landslide of earth. It was only when he saw the rhythmic rise and fall of a massive chest that he realized he was looking at a living creature. The giant was injured, with a deep, jagged wound in its left thigh, and it was watching Renner with an intelligence that was unnervingly human. Renner stood paralyzed in the freezing rain for nearly 20 minutes, locked in a silent exchange with the being. Finally, the giant raised a hand, a palm the size of a dinner platter, in a universal gesture of supplication. It was asking for mercy. Renner's compassion overrode his fear. Without telling his family, he utilized a heavy sled and his strongest draft horse, Gus, to laboriously drag the giant into the barn under the cover of darkness. The wound on the giant's leg was horrific, a saucer-sized gouge that leaked a dark, resinous substance instead of red blood. Renner treated the injury with carbolic acid and bound it with strips of bedsheets, all while the giant remained stoically silent. It was only after the wound was dressed that the giant spoke. His voice was a tectonic rumble, slow and resonant like the sound of boulders grinding in a deep riverbed. To Renner's shock, the words were in English. "Thank you," the giant said. "I have been walking for a very long time." For the next 6 months, Renner lived a double life. He convinced Martha and Mary Two Rivers that the barn was under quarantine due to a contagious livestock illness. This allowed him the privacy to nurse the giant, whom he came to know as Arvik, back to health. Each night, after his family had retired, Renner would retreat to the barn with a lantern and a notebook. What followed were a series of conversations that would eventually lead to Renner's institutionalization, for the truths Arvik shared were too dangerous for the era. Arvik revealed that the history Renner had been taught was a fabrication, a recent invention designed to hide a much older and more complex reality. He spoke of a time within the memory of his own people when the American continent was dotted with magnificent cities that no longer appeared on any map. These were not the primitive settlements of indigenous tribes, but metropolises featuring towers of polished stone, expansive paved squares, and sophisticated technology. Arvik described fountains that flowed without mechanical pumps and lights that glowed with a steady brilliance without the need for flame or oil. He explained that these cities were inhabited by a race of people who were significantly taller than the average human, many standing between 8 and 10 feet tall. Then, Arvik spoke of the burying. He described a cataclysmic event, a great flood of mud and earth that rose with such speed and force that it swallowed entire towns. In some regions, the mud reached the second stories of the great stone buildings. In others, it completely submerged the landscape, leaving only the peaks of the tallest structures exposed. Following this burying, the survivors of Arvik's kind were hunted. They were viewed as remnants of a world that the new powers that be wanted forgotten. Renner, a man of faith and logic, initially struggled to believe these tales. He demanded proof. In response, Arvik gave him precise directions to a specific location in the nearby foothills. There, Arvik claimed, a stone door remained buried under 15 feet of sediment. Renner rode out the following day and dug with a fervor he had never known. Hours later, his shovel struck something hard. He cleared away the dirt to reveal the top of a massive stone arch, intricately carved with symbols and geometric patterns that bore no resemblance to any known culture. Terrified by the implications, Renner covered the site and returned home, now a firm believer in Arvik's testimony. As the months passed, Arvik shared more about the systematic erasure of his people. He claimed that the United States Army was well aware of the giants' existence and had been actively collecting them, both living and dead, for over 3 decades. He explained that whenever a rancher or miner discovered enormous bones, men in dark blue uniforms would arrive within 48 hours to seize the remains. This was not a coincidence. It was a calculated policy of historical sanitization. The goal was to ensure that the current settlers believed they were the first civilized inhabitants of a new world, rather than the inheritors of a ruined one. Arvik knew his time was short. He warned Renner that if he were found, the authorities would either kill him or take him to a place where he would wish they had killed me. By late September, Arvik's wound had healed sufficiently for him to walk. He planned to depart for the Wind River Range during the new moon on October 14th, where he hoped to reunite with other survivors hiding in a vast cave network. Renner prepared for the journey, sewing a massive coat from 3 buffalo hides and carving a heavy walking staff from ironwood. He intended to escort his friend to the Idaho border. But the policy of erasure moved faster than they anticipated. On the morning of October 9th, a column of 22 cavalrymen, led by a Captain Holcomb, arrived at the Renner farm. They acted with the cold efficiency of men on a mission of state importance. They bypassed the house and immediately surrounded the barn. When Renner refused to grant them entry, they used axes to shatter the locks. Inside, Arvik did not fight. He sat with his back against the timber wall, the buffalo hide coat draped over his massive frame. As the soldiers stared in a mixture of awe and horror, Arvik looked at Renner through the dust-moted light and gave a single, solemn nod of understanding. It took 8 men to manhandle the giant into a specialized wagon with reinforced iron grates. Captain Holcomb informed Renner that he was being detained for harboring a fugitive of the United States government, though no formal charges were ever filed. Renner was hauled away in a separate wagon, leaving his terrified family behind with a stern warning. Any mention of what they had seen would result in the forfeiture of their land and their freedom. Elijah Renner's spirit was broken in the weeks that followed. Held in an Army stockade and later transferred to the Montana Territorial Asylum, he was diagnosed with frontier dementia, a convenient label for a man who knew too much. He died 4 years later, a forgotten prisoner of a history he tried to preserve. The second journal, however, provides the final chilling piece of the puzzle. In the entry dated October 8th, the night before the army arrived, Renner recorded Arvik's final prophecy. The giant had sensed the soldiers' approach from miles away, hearing the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves through the earth itself. He told Renner, "Your people will be told that we were never here. They will be told that the bones in the ground belong to animals, and that the cities under the soil are mere geological accidents. This deception will last for 150 years. But the soil keeps memory better than men do. When the time comes to remember, the soil will speak first. Watch the rivers, watch the dry summers, and watch what is revealed when the ground is opened." Renner's final sentence in that hidden book, written just hours before his arrest, remains a haunting testament to his experience. He said, "The truth does not die. It only waits." What became of Arvik remains one of the great mysteries of the American West. Military records from that period in the Montana Territory are notoriously incomplete, with many files from the autumn of 1879 missing or heavily redacted. No unclassified document mentions a captured giant. The trail of the wagon train leads towards a railhead in Bismarck, Dakota Territory, a hub from which cargo could be shipped to any destination in the nation. Some researchers, tracking the movement of anomalous artifacts, believe Arvik was transported to the Smithsonian Institution, which was known during that era for cataloging giant skeletal remains before they vanished into undisclosed storage. Others suggest a more clandestine destination, a military facility in Maryland that has since been scrubbed from official maps. Regardless of Arvik's ultimate fate, the legacy of Elijah Renner's secret continues to resonate. The story suggests that the empty frontier was a graveyard of a much grander civilization, and that the pioneers were walking over the rooftops of a buried world. The stone foundations, the precision-cut wells, and the massive skeletons reported in 19th century newspapers were not isolated anomalies. They were the protruding edges of a hidden reality that the authorities of the time were desperate to suppress. This is not merely a fringe theory. It is a pattern of evidence. The newspapers are real. The testimonials from 19th century professionals are on the record. The only thing missing is the physical evidence, the bones and the artifacts that were systematically collected and sequestered. Elijah Renner died in a cold asylum cell, believing that the truth would eventually resurface in the time of his great-grandchildren. He believed that the earth itself would eventually refuse to hold the secret any longer. Today, as we see more reports of ancient structures emerging from receding glaciers, or strange ruins revealed by shifting riverbeds and extreme droughts, we must wonder if the waiting that Arvik spoke of is finally coming to an end. The second journal of Elijah Renner, hidden for a century, serves as a crack in the wall of the official narrative. It reminds us that the history we are taught is often just a thin veil pulled over a much more complex and ancient truth. If you have followed this account to its conclusion, you likely feel the same dissonance that many of us feel when looking at the standard chronology of human progress. The idea of a neat history, one that begins with primitive settlers and moves linearly toward the industrial age, fails to account for the anomalies that Elijah Renner saw with his own eyes. It fails to account for the giant in the barn who spoke of lights without fire and cities beneath the mud. The truth does not die. It remains buried beneath the weight of years and the deliberate silence of institutions. But it is there, waiting for the soil to speak. And as the ground continues to open, we must be prepared to listen to what it has to say. The story of Elijah Renner and Arvik is not just a tale of the Old West. It is a warning and a promise that the memory of the world is longer than the memory of men. The soil is beginning to speak. Are you listening?